Good morning. My name is Kelly O'Brien, and I am the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance Chief Advocacy and Strategy Officer. We're so excited that you're starting your day with us as we have this really important program, Advocacy in Action, focusing on the City of Charlotte's 2040 Comprehensive Plan. We have the city and a voice from the private sector joining us today to help us understand what the comp plan means for the City of Charlotte and to answer your questions. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Taiwo Jayoba. Taiwo is focused on the future of Charlotte as the Assistant City Manager and Director of Planning, Design, and Development. His work on the development of Charlotte's future 2040 comprehensive plan demonstrates his ability to bring people together in the pursuit of a common goal. Taiwo is a champion and architect for the mobility, accessibility, and connectivity efforts designed to benefit Charlotte residents. And when I was fortunate enough to take this position and join the Charlotte community, Taiwo was so welcoming, and it was such an important time for the work that you are doing. Taiwo, I have really appreciated the time that we have spent together and all that I have learned from you, and really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Good morning.
Good morning. And then our other speaker is Rob Nanfeld, and Rob is the Executive Director of the Real Estate and Building Industry Coalition, REBIC. REBIC is an organization of trade associations formed to take collaborative action on issues of concern to the broad membership engaged in the sales, building, development, finance, management, and leasing of real estate. The primary members of REBIC are the Charlotte Regional Realtor Association and Home Builders Association of Greater Charlotte. The organization also includes the Greater Charlotte Apartment Association, the Charlotte Region Commercial Board of Realtors, and NAIOP Charlotte, Commercial Real Estate Development Association, as well as a number of leading area development firms. For those of you that know me, you know that I have been involved in real estate since the 1990s, both working in private finance and then in my last role with developers and really looking at the important role that development plays in a city and its neighborhoods. So Rob, we really appreciate the perspective that you will bring to today's conversation. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.
So what we are going to do for our audience today is we're going to ask our Assistant City Manager to help us understand kind of the foundation, the fundamentals of the comp plan. So we understand that the audience is joining us today with different levels of understanding. Some may be joining really maybe only hearing that there was a comp plan, but not having any idea of its contents. And others may have read all of the hundreds and hundreds of pages. I know that this plan was adopted as policy in June of this year. And Taiwo, I know that it was a yeoman's effort getting that plan together and then getting it approved. So we really look forward to having you help us understand what is this plan.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. Good morning again, everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am especially grateful to Rob for joining me on this. Let me kind of quickly go back to July after the plan itself was adopted by Council in June. Rob and I reached out to each other, and we found that we actually have a lot more in common as individuals, and sometimes you get so deeply involved in your professional positions that you miss the person and how important they are and how you actually relate to them on many levels. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to connect with Rob. But Alison, Craig, our Deputy Director, and myself have also been having some monthly opportunities with Rob and REBIC just to kind of as we move towards the next step, what are the things that we can both capture that will really help us to move forward on Unified Development Ordinance, and I will talk about that a little bit. So the first question, of course, is what Kelly asked. What exactly is this plan? Comprehensive plan. Sometimes because of the word comprehensive, you try to do so much, and in the process, you end up, doing too little because you're trying to touch everything. But that's really what a comprehensive plan, land use plan is supposed to do. At the end of the day, it's a primarily land use plan that connects everything. And as you can see on the graphic in front of you, it's supposed to touch everything that we do in the urban space, together in such a way that it accommodates living options, play options, workplaces, the different things that we do in the housing space, in the transportation space, in the jobs creation, sustainability space. If we can understand this particular graphic, then you know that everything you do between the time you wake up and the time you go to bed, if it happens in the urban space, then the comprehensive plan becomes part and parcel of what you do, but most of what you experience. But most people don't think about that until someone cuts a tree, in the neighborhood, or maybe when they're encountering bad traffic on their way to driving their kids to school, or maybe there's a property being rezoned next door that they just don't like, or a sidewalk that they're using ends abruptly. They don't realize that there's a lot that goes into that. And a plan helps us to be able to avoid some of those problems, especially to be able to plan in a smart way. So as a growing city, Charlotte for a long time did not have a comprehensive plan that's citywide. And we cannot afford to leave growth and development to chance. Despite the pandemic, we saw over almost 2,000 different building permits were pulled and over 230 rezoning petitions, which really tells us that we're growing so fast as a city. And a plan like this helps us to be able to plan in a smart manner, especially for the next generation. So if you could give me the next slide. So I've got a couple of slides I'll just share with us. This particular slide here is really how the plan itself is organized. We call it the equitable growth framework around which the comprehensive plan is organized. Call it the plan's DNA, if you will. It captures the essence of what the plan itself is about, the process, the outcomes. So it starts with a set of guiding principles and vision elements, which were a result of community input from the very first phase. So we broke the phases into 4. So the first phase of community engagement was for the community to help us define what kind of Charlotte do you want for the next 20 years? What are the principles that we should be thinking about, that we should have at the top of our mind as we shape policies and goals? And equity obviously was very important, but also creating a city that's uniquely Charlotte. We know we've got a lot of people from different parts of the world living in Charlotte, but how can we continue to have that authenticity about us? And how can we make sure that our city is not just known as a city of crescent and wedge, but it's integrated so that any Charlottean could really live wherever they want to live or work wherever they want to work and be able to connect the spaces in between. And of course, how can we continue? We know that climate action really is very important, and climate is the defining issue of our time, but how can we continue to build a resilient city? Those form the basis of the vision elements and ultimately became what defined the 10 plan goals and the policies and the 13 different big ideas. But for each goal, there's a backstory, and that backstory is centered around equity. Because how can a future plan address the inequities of the past that created the crescent and the wedge that we have in our city today? Believe it or not, planning and zoning practices contributed to the type of inequity we have, not just in Charlotte, but in any major metro area in the United States today. It doesn't matter which one you go to, you're going to hear about redlining, urban renewal, and how they affected the future of people who were displaced back then. How can we make sure that we have a plan that not only talks about future, but how to also make sure that there are policies and goals and metrics that will help us to measure how we achieve these goals when we get there. The third slide really is about, it's not just a plan, right? It's about how does it also connect. So if you can give me the third slide, because in order for a plan to be effective, right, it has to be relatable to other policies and regulations. So 2 other documents that really help to bring this plan to life, a strategic mobility plan. In other words, how people can get from one place to another the strategic mobility plan is really about our mobility future to define how we connect in the urban environment. And then the Unified Development Ordinance, which is really a set of regulations. So on one hand, the comprehensive plan is that vision. And the mapping exercise we've been going through over the last several weeks translate those policies into visual, into what we can actually see, where people live, where they go to play, where they work, how, impact on, buildings or, sidewalks or driveways or whatever it is that people do in the urban space. That policy map helps to translate the policies in the comprehensive plan that are based on places, translate them into graphic that people can see. And that was released yesterday. The Unified Development Ordinance was released last week. The first draft of it was released last week. And over the next 4 months, we're going to be entertaining comments and reviews. But the thing about the Unified Development Ordinance is, yes, it's about 608 pages. But think about the fact that it consolidates 8 different documents into one. Each of those documents put together total about 1,120 pages. But the Unified Development Ordinance really consolidates them, eliminates redundancies, tries to make the regulations and ordinances that will implement the plan, make them more user-friendly and more direct and concise so that, we remove a lot of conflicting elements and whatever is outdated. Some of those things, some of those regs were written as far back as 1978. Perhaps the most recent ones were in 2014 as a result of amendment. How can we make sure that we do not have a plan that talks about the next 20 years, but you've got to also update the regulations that can bring those policies to life in the 21st century. So that's kind of why these 2 or 3 documents really have to work together. And my final slide, which is the next slide, is really focused on the UDO Unified Development Ordinance itself. I know it looks very busy, but this is really the current schedule. Obviously, you cannot have a 600-page document and have a very flimsy schedule. It's got to be very intense. And so the intensity is built around the engagement. How can we make sure that we engage the development community, the advocacy groups, the environmental community, residents in our city? How can we make sure that this is not just a document that only the experts can understand, but even the normal resident who does the business day to day, whether it be a center city or university city or Beresford Road, they understand the impact of development and how it may affect their day-to-day life. I believe that having this type of schedule allows us to be able to really look forward to, if we are asking council to adopt the policy map, for example, in February, and then you're asking them to adopt the Unified Development Ordinance in July, it's important for them to know what occupies the space between here and there. And so that's why we've built this really intense schedule to engage, but also to include economic analysis in the process. So that process of economic analysis will actually start on the 28th of this month. Actually, I believe on the 27th of this month, we're meeting with some stakeholders that are made up of folks who might actually be on this call this morning, development industry, representing the design industry, to make sure that they are looking at, if we are having some regulatory tools, what are the financial implications of those? What are the things that we can do to mitigate some of the financial implications of these regulations? So that process will continue over the next few months through January. It will result in us having a second draft, I believe, of the Unified Development Ordinance right around the same time in 2022. 4 different drafts are envisioned for the Unified Development Ordinance. The first draft came out last week. The second draft will come out early in the year at the same time as we conclude work on the economic analysis. The third draft will be more of the public hearing draft. And then the final draft, the fourth draft, will be the adoption draft. And subsequent drafts will be redlined so people know what comments have been made and how we've responded to those. So that's really where we are. And I will stop sharing now, but that's really where we are. I know Rob will have some thoughts on this, and we'll be happy to take questions that our audience may have. So Kelly, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Taiwo. And before we get to Rob, just say a couple quick questions for you. In the beginning of pulling together the comp plan, can you help us understand, what was your thoughts in terms of going into this? And do you feel that the policy that was adopted is the result of what you had hoped when you started the process?
Very good question, Kelly. So we did a pre-work for several weeks before the comprehensive plan was started. One of the things that we did was we had a design sprint. We had an independent consultant pull together different stakeholders from the community to actually ask a series of questions. Where are we today? What are the things that are missing in our city? What kind of city do we want to become? And I believe that design sprint went on for about 2 or 3 days to gather information. And it resulted in the first product in the plan, which we call an equity atlas. If you go on the comprehensive plan website, cltfuture2040.org, you'll see the document there. It really captured a number of things. But one of the things that was very important for us to understand was that Charlotte at that time was the 17th largest city in the country by population. That was about 3 years or so ago. But we found out that outside of New York, Charlotte was the only city that had no comprehensive plan of all the top 17 cities in the country. New York, of course, had their plans by boroughs rather than by citywide, because, of course, it's a huge city. And Charlotte was the only city of that number in the Southeast that had none. And the last time we had was 1975. We had a generalized land use plan in 1985. And that 1985 generalized land use plan became the basis for almost 90 different community plans that we have in the city today. Because what that generalized land use plan did was this: it broke Charlotte into 5 different geographies and began to just create different pockets. And there's no way you can grow a city by having different pocket plans, because then everything looks like a patchwork. And so this was the first time we're going to actually say, let's go on and do a citywide plan. And part of the design sprint was also to look at other cities. We picked about 7 different cities that we believed had something in common with Charlotte, but also that were aspirational cities that we wanted to be, like a Denver, a Austin. We looked at Austin, we looked at Denver. Raleigh had its own comprehensive plan about 10 years ago. We felt we needed to learn from them, as they also had their Unified Development Ordinance. We looked at Minneapolis. We looked at Montreal as a city. We looked at Vancouver, Canada. So we picked 2 cities in Canada, and I believe 5 cities in the United States that had some things around housing, transportation, equity, sustainability, open spaces, recreational areas, jobs creations, being able to attract big companies. We looked at Seattle. And so all of those things taught us a number of things, that if we were going to have a successful plan, you got to focus on key things: housing, transportation, transit, making sure that people can live close to where they work or close to where they play and have options. So those are the thoughts that went into the plan. With regards to the last piece of your question, did the policies match some of those initial things? Yes. Because it was very important for us. Let me quickly share this. Back in February 2020, some of you may be familiar with S&P Global Ratings. They actually called out the Charlotte Future 2040 plan. They said that, in addition to the city's policies and management practices, Charlotte, and our quote here, is developing the Future 2040 plan to guide growth and achieve a shared vision for development and capital investment. And they said, this plan is good for Charlotte because it will include developing neighborhoods that provide residents safe and convenient access to jobs, goods, services, and other essentials. So we felt that that was a validation that we're headed in the right direction with a number of things. Not only was the plan dealing with policies relating to people who live here, but it was also dealing with policies relating to jobs creation and businesses thriving in the city. So again, that's kind of how we go where we are today.
Thank you, Taiwo. Rob, if you'd like to unmute yourself. It's interesting to hear that Charlotte was one of the only cities that did not have a comprehensive plan. So I'm curious, from your role, again, back when this was first started to be discussed, how did you initially expect this comprehensive plan to unfold? And I know you've played a major part in providing insights. So help the audience understand what REBIC has done to help enhance the plan that we have.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it. Thanks for setting this up. And Taiwo, thank you. It has been a pleasure getting to know you better through this process, especially lately. Just a little bit about REBIC. Our founders, Alan Tate, John Carlson, those should be familiar names to you, saw REBIC as essentially one day being the voice of real estate in the region. They hatched this idea back in the 1980s and it was formalized in the 1990s. And Kelly went down sort of our roster of members, but essentially we represent anybody that touches real estate within the Charlotte region. As it relates to the plan, I think we would all agree that a plan was necessary. It was time to update and go forward. We're growing so quickly. I believe we're anywhere between the 5th and the 7th hottest real estate market in the country, depending on which study you're looking at and what day it is. So clearly, planning for the future was something that needed to be done. I think when the plan initially came out, we had some concerns, and I think we had the opportunity to share those. Of course, we went through a pretty lengthy process on that. We're successful in getting a bit of a delay with City Council so that we could further sort of work through some of those concerns. And I think initially, those were really, if you want to go into just a little bit of detail, we were concerned about some of the impact fees that were mentioned because that drives additional costs, mandatory inclusionary zoning provision, what we call the trees trump everything provision, which I believe was 7.23, and Taiwo can correct me on that number. But we were concerned that essentially trees were given paramount authority in the initial plan. We were also concerned about the process. We felt like we did have an opportunity to provide input. We didn't feel like we were getting a lot of feedback as we were going forward. We also had a city council that I don't think initially had a lot of knowledge of the plan. I think as they went through it, they gained a lot more. And I think both staff, as well as the private sector, as well as the community, was actually pretty effective in helping with that communication effort. So I think as it went forward, and when we talk about the plan, it's really was 3 pieces. It was initially it was called volume 1, 2, and 3, now referred to as policy, implementation, and manuals and metrics. The first part of that, the policy piece, was what was passed on June 21st. And that was about 120-ish pages of the initial 320 some pages of documents. So there still are the 2 other pieces, implementation and manuals and metrics, that are kind of hanging out there. I know there was some discussion during the city council meeting on Monday about what sort of to do with that. And I think that's still an open question, although I think at this point, everybody understands that's going to sort of be rolled into the mapping and UDO and all of that as we go forward. And Taiwo can correct me if I'm incorrect about that, but I think that's sort of where we've landed at this point. What resulted in that policy piece, I think, were some of the changes that were made based on some of the input we gave, as well as others. So I think we were comfortable at that point. We didn't support everything in the plan, but we were comfortable with supporting the idea of moving forward and getting on with it. And I think that's the message that we gave. I will tell you that the first email I received following the vote was from Taiwo. And he said, hey, we really need to get together on this because I don't want to repeat what happened the last several months. And I know that gave me additional gray hairs. You can see them here in my beard as well. So we have met several times. We've had Allison Craig in the department, who's really kind of the team lead on the UDO. She and Taiwo and our leadership at REBIC have met, I believe, 3 times at this point. Taiwo and I had breakfast individually, which was enjoyable. And I think continuing that dialogue is really going to help us defray a lot of some of the stuff that we really don't need to deal with down the road. Let's approach that and handle it on the front end. And then we'll have disagreements. We'll have policy disagreements down the road, and we can just sort of fight that out in public and determine what we think is the best policy going forward for the community at large, not just development industry, but the community at large, because that's important to us. There were a couple of things that we did support that were included in parts of the plan that didn't get passed yet, and that involved aging in place pieces going to the General Assembly to try to expand what some call in other states the homestead exemption for people that will help them stay in their homes longer. That has to do with the displacement piece of this as well. So there were components that were included. As it relates to the UDO, Taiwo said it's 608 pages long. We have started to sort of digest it piece by piece. Initially, I think there are some good elements in it. The idea of having a streamlined approach through the development process that we can develop more uncertainty. I think there are things in there right now which are going to drive costs substantially, and that is a concern. But if on the other end, we can shorten the timeline, create greater certainty, well, then there's a bit of a trade-off. And so part of the next 9 months that we're going to go through is determining what that trade-off looks like and whether we can get there or not. Affordable housing is clearly an important issue, not just to our group, but just to the community at large. And finding a way to carve out the ability to ratchet up the amount of units that we provide that are affordable, and creating better affordability in general of housing, I think is very important to us. So we'll be looking at specific things like design requirements, building material requirements as it relates to apartments and mixed use type of things. There's a provision in there about short-term rentals. So any of your members with the Alliance that have concerns about that, that's something to look at. Stormwater regulations are going to be tightened a bit. That's always something that's very, very controversial. There are tree regulations, one of which is that if you have private property and you have trees on your property, going forward, if passed, this will require you to get a permit to take trees down on your own property, which could be controversial, and it could be costly for some homeowners. So that's something that needs to be looked at. Transportation studies, which are also very expensive, looks like they're going to be necessary on all developments going forward. And sometimes there's a necessity for those, but where does that threshold come in? Again, if there's a speedy process, we can create certainty. I think we can dissuade some of these costs, but these are all things that we're going to have to balance as we move forward on the UDO.
Thank you, Rob. I wonder if you can share, are there any similar themes in the Charlotte 2040 plan when you compare to other approaches as it relates to housing from other cities, other plans?
Well, I think Taiwo can speak more to that than I can because he's a professional planner. But I know that they did take examples. I think he went down some of the cities that they had looked at to compare and contrast. I lived in Denver actually for a while before we moved here to Charlotte, and Denver's a great city. And I think taking some of the good from Denver is a great idea. Now, housing in Denver is not exactly cheap. Neither is it in Seattle or some of the other places that were mentioned. So they haven't been able to crack that nut of affordability, but I expect more from Charlotte. I think we can get there. I think we have builders both that do connected units as well as single family that really want to play a part and a role in that. And I know there are things that are going on right now with respect to waiving permits, doing some sort of where there's a trade-off. Maybe the developer in some case doesn't make quite as much of a profit, but the city takes a little haircut as well. And as a result, we create more units that are available to folks that are in that sort of missing middle that we describe so often. So I think that Taiwo, I don't know if you want to talk about other cities or not. But
you're right. For example, if you watch Monday's council meeting, I think the subject of tiny homes came up. Right, I think it was Councilmember Phipps who was asking about that, and if the UDO supports that. The response to that, of course, is the fact that we've never really regulated sizes of houses in Charlotte, so tiny homes are allowed. However, it's more of a mindset, right, whether people will embrace that or not. So looking at other communities where they've actually done some work around tiny homes or around accessory dwelling units or cottages, like Raleigh, for example, at Wilmington. There were some other cities, smaller towns, even within North Carolina, because sometimes you look at all these other cities, but their statewide regulations allow them to do some of those things, which our state regulations may not allow us to do legally. And so it's kind of dancing that fine balance between great ideas, but then you come home and you can't really do that. how do we look at some other communities in our state that are doing some of these things? So Raleigh became a really good example, frankly speaking, especially when it comes to cottages. So that influenced how we looked at that idea in the comprehensive plan, but also in the UDO. We looked at how, for example, the subject of community benefits came up during the comprehensive plan. That became very sticky point as well. It's not that REBIC is against community benefits. I'll be very careful to mention that. It's that if you're going to do community benefits and the city is not a party to it, it's got to be that the community and the developers come together with an agreement or some of the discussion between themselves that will not financially burden the development. And that's very important because sometimes we want to do good, but then there are unintended consequences, right? That may financially burden the business, and we definitely don't want to do that. So the thought around that, having been a consultant, I worked on multiple community benefits, whether they be in Atlanta or they be in Detroit or they be in Minneapolis. And I know that or Nashville, it all depends on how they are shaped, and every community differs from one place to another. So that was another thought that we thought that the comprehensive plan could really embrace and really have a conversation around that. The difference, though, is that some of those other communities that I mentioned, the General Assembly will typically have something that will support that, clearly in their legislation. We don't have that in North Carolina. So we have to kind of work around that in such a way that it doesn't create too much angst. That generated a lot of controversy. But now we've come to a point where we had the first stakeholders group meeting on community benefits about 2 weeks ago, Rob? I forgot now.
Yeah, I believe it was about 2 weeks.
2 weeks ago. And I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but I think we all feel better if we say it's more of a toolkit rather than it's an agreement concept, and that it only can be an agreement that the city participates in if we have property in it. But if it's something that the developer is doing with the community, it's something that they will have, it's an option, something like that. And so being able to, I think success for us is being able to get the development industry and the community really begin to have that conversation among themselves about what exactly is this. So that's another example. Other example that I would say is taller buildings and density bonus, right? We've had that as part of our transit-oriented development ordinance, and it's worked out well. But once you start tying other things to it, it can unnerve some folks. So in the comprehensive plan, initially, we said if you build up to 500 feet uptown, then you trigger community benefits. And we had loud and clear that no, that's not something that the development industry, in fact, some of our elected officials felt that we were capping height. So that was a compromise we had to make in the plan, was to remove that from the plan. And so when you're uptown, you can build as tall as you want to. You're still going to trigger some benefits, such as what you contribute or what's the impact to transportation. That happens today. We don't have to wait until the future to make that happen. So the UDO carries that policy forward by not referencing 500 feet tall, but just basically opening it up. So there are certain things here and there that in Seattle, I believe they have height limits uptown. But what they do is that once you go beyond that, you contribute something towards homelessness, I believe, and towards sustainability. So again, every city is different in terms of how they approach the thing. So when we learn from some of these communities, we learn how not to be what they've become negatively, but what are also the good things that they've done that we could bring home, reshape, and make it our own. The idea behind a neighborhood stabilization, anti-displacement, for example, commission, that came from Austin. We learned from what they did as part of their plan. And then they went ahead and did a referendum. We have no referendum as part of ours, but we felt that that was a brilliant idea from Austin that we could test here in Charlotte. And we've kind of done it in a way that it's also a Charlotte-centered thing. So all of these communities that we looked at have one thing or the other that might be working. The advantage that we have in Charlotte, I tell you, and I don't know how many communities really across the country you can say this about. is that we're willing to try things. And then if it doesn't work, we're willing to come around and say, how can we make this work better? Some may call it the Charlotte way, but I think that in a way, being able to come together on things that we disagree about and find a way to still move forward, I think it's something that's good for our city. And so when you bring up some of these good ideas and you bring them home, it's really finding a way around how can we make them ours that work for us and our residents, rather than just something that's imported into Charlotte that doesn't work.
Thank you, Taiwo. And to our audience, we do want to answer your questions. So you'll see in the chat that one of my colleagues, Audrey Rowe, is available for you to message her a question, and I can read that out loud, or feel free to unmute yourself and you are welcome to ask your question directly. So Rob, I would ask, in terms of the development community, is there anything that you would say has changed in the development world kind of before June when this policy was adopted to now after the policy?
I don't think so. I mean, anytime a plan, the legislature has, specific statute that says a plan is a plan. There's nothing legally binding about it. It's really the nuts and bolts come in the UDO, which is the discussion right now. So the plan kind of sets the stage, but the UDO is really where the rubber hits the road. So I don't know that anything has changed necessarily. I think as it relates to the development community and real estate in large is, I mean, we try to meet the needs of the market. That's what we do. We don't build just because we like to build certain things. We build to meet the needs of the market. So I think that's an important thing to mention. Now, I want to tie back to Taiwo's comment about the legislature. As it relates to North Carolina, and I think I have made this commitment to Taiwo before, that if there's an idea that we can come up with together where we can go to the legislature hand in hand and say, look, we think we need to tweak this a little bit because we think we've found a solution to at least this problem, then we'll do that. We'll do that together and we'll work on that. Not to say we can automatically have success, but we will work on that with you. So that's, we've made that commitment. We continue that commitment. Now, on a detail item, and this is something we haven't talked about, and somebody may ask a question about this, but the duplex, triplex, quad issue that was in the plan, which I think really, I mean, if we're being honest about it, really drove the 6-5 vote that occurred on the 21st. There were some folks that just could not reach a comfort level on that on council. Our industry, that was not something we ever opposed. In fact, higher density, we realize as Charlotte moves forward, that's the way we're going to have to grow. That's better, efficient use of existing infrastructure. These are all positive things. In fact, I read an article from the New York Times over the weekend, I believe it was Saturday or Sunday, where the state of California has essentially statewide allowed duplexes, triplexes. I don't know, Taiwo, you may be able to expand on that. You may know more about it, but also the use of accessory dwelling units, which is another affordable housing component. The city of Charlotte already has ADU regulations on the books, but I believe that the UDO is going to expand that and make that even easier as we go forward. That's a positive development. That's really going to help sort of meet that need of affordability. So I think those are good things. I just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of that commitment to work with the legislature to work to change things as we can and need to.
Well, and the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance really commends that effort, the collaborative spirit, and we certainly would want to be a part of those efforts. We did receive a question from an audience member, and it reads, moving forward, where are we on inclusionary zoning? And so for those folks that may not understand what inclusionary zoning is, if you could please explain that and then answer the question.
Okay, Rob, you want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay, so inclusionary zoning, for those who don't understand, who may need some clarity on that, is when we actually build and then we require the developers that they've got to provide certain percentage or make certain percentage of their units dedicated to affordable housing, whether they be 80% of the area median income, which I believe is 79,100 or so right now, or 60% or 30% or whatever that number is. We don't have the ability in the state of North Carolina to require developers to provide affordable housing units with their residential development. However, the comprehensive plan identifies certain things, which is part of what I said earlier on, certain things that while the state right now legislatively does not allow, they are aspirational for us as a city. In other words, is this something that maybe 10 years, 15, 20 years from now is doable? And when you're creating a long-term strategic plan, you've got to make provision for anything that's possible 10, 20 years from now that may not be doable today. And subsequently, as the plan gets revised or amended, it will continue to reflect things that may be possible. What we did was to move those things into the preamble of the comprehensive plan. There are no policies that are developed around them outside of to say that the city will lead or pursue this opportunity in the future. One of them being inclusionary housing. Another could be what did we call in our impact fees, if the opportunity does occur in the future. However, there's a part of the comprehensive plan that incentivizes affordable housing provision. For example, if you provide quadruplexes, which are 4 units in one building on arterials, we support that, provided one of those units is dedicated to affordable housing. So while we may not be able to have inclusionary zoning, we can have incentives that will allow the developers. Rob mentioned something previously. Sometimes it could be waiving fees. Sometimes it could be expediting the rezoning process, or expediting the permitting process, and the developer is incentivized to do more. We see that is happening now. We see people walk in and say they will do this, and so the plan has it there, but it has it as part of our aspirational goals. Again, building on what the Leading on Opportunity Task Force recommended for inclusionary zoning in the future. And I'll end with this, though. It's a caution in my mind about inclusionary zoning. We've done our own work and realized that states and cities that have them, they don't necessarily generate more housing units overall compared to states that don't have them. It's not significantly different. It's just going to be another tool in the toolkit if we were to have it. It does not necessarily mean that having it means we're going to generate 1,000 units of affordable housing. We've seen that, we've compared that, and we know that having it is just another tool, and we want to continue to amass whatever tools we can to address the issue of affordable housing.
Rob, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, if I can. This is one of the places where Taiwo and I may just differ a bit on policy, because our feeling on inclusion, and I hate, it's kind of a misnomer. I hate the term inclusionary zoning, because I guess our perspective is really, when you do a set aside, and that's really what you're doing, 10% or 20% of the units in a development for people making a certain amount of area median income, whether it's 60%, 80%, whatever the case may be, you're creating an invisible tax on the other 80 to 90% of people that are buying homes in that area, because there's got to be a way to make up that difference in revenue loss. So that hidden tax raises the cost of housing for that larger group of people, which creates a ripple effect to the area around and ultimately to the market at large. So I don't necessarily think that's the answer. And I think Taiwo said it himself, that other states and cities that have done this haven't seen a huge increase in affordable units as well. So maybe let's keep talking about the other stuff we agree about and work towards those as resolutions.
We have another question from the audience. Can you speak on the idea of having the private sector and developers pay for more off-site infrastructure?
Interesting. I don't know what that is especially referring to, but I think I can speak to this from a transit-oriented development ordinance perspective. When that ordinance was adopted by council, one of the things that we had included in there was that if a developer, for example, if you are allowed to build up to maybe 130 feet tall next to a transit station, and then you exceed that and you go to about 200 feet, for example, let's say, there's a benefit or an incentive or a bonus that comes to you, either to see that you will contribute something towards affordable housing, maybe units in that particular development, or contribution towards the housing trust fund. One of the things that was also part of that is that it may not necessarily be that that contribution is used right there within a half-mile radius of the transit station, but it could actually be about a mile or so away. Right now, we ask developers to build sidewalks today, and they do. The city also has to do its own part, right, to be able to make sure that we have, we meet developers in that space where we wherever they end, we extend it. But as you and I know, that's very expensive to do today. Part of the things that we're hopeful that in the UDO, we continue to discuss how to make sure that even if there are some financial obligations to developers related to infrastructure, how can we also create an opportunity for them on the back end or on the front end, either by waiving some fees or by expediting their process, so that whatever that payment is for some offsite infrastructure that directly benefits the development, they also have some incentives that really mitigate, that pay. But I don't know how you define offsite. We're definitely not going to have a developer that's building something in one geography to be contributing to sidewalks in another geography. That's definitely not in the plan, and it's not in the UDO.
I think, Kelly, if I can just add to that, I think Taiwo said something very significant when we talk about really bringing, what we're talking about is bringing infrastructure up to date, really. And we want to encourage more infill development for better utilization of our existing infrastructure. But if somebody wants to redevelop a site and ends up having to build the whole street, rebuild the whole street and the whole process, well, that disincentivizes because it's very costly. So it's finding that fine line between, okay, how do we incentivize that kind of development, but also have the city pay essentially their share of the upgrade that probably should have been occurring all along in the process. That's a really tough question to answer, but that's really where we need to get in order to move forward.
I think that if I can add to that, that's also part of the whole conversation around transformation and mobility network, which is really about the 1 cent sales tax, if we ever get that. A huge part of that is building out our street network, sidewalks, at least from the public sector. And because, like I said, I think the private sector is doing their part when it comes to building the sidewalk associated with a particular development. The public sector, that is the city, has to also find ways by which we can. Right now, it's hard for us to build. At the rate at which we're building sidewalks, probably would take us 200 and some years to finally finish building them, unless we have that infusion of extra dollars to be able to match what the development industry is doing.
And while we're on the subject of challenges, Rob, I wonder if you can share with the audience, we're all experiencing, Charlotte, just this accelerated growth. So what would you say is kind of the biggest challenge for the development community to kind of keep up with the pace of the need for housing as we have over 130 people a day moving into the Charlotte region?
It's definitely a challenge. I mean, right now, and this is the National Association of Home Builders that does a study every year where they determine what the regulatory cost per unit is for a home, a dwelling. And right now it's about roughly 25% is a regulatory cost. So some of that is necessary. Obviously, there's health and safety reasons to have regulations, but some of that may not be. I mean, that's a pretty huge chunk of a new home. So keeping up with that, timber prices have been all over the place. Obviously, with the pandemic, the supply chain is all out of whack right now, just for basic things like you've got some yogurt this morning, Kelly. Good for you. You got your hands on some. It's meeting those challenges, which have been odd over the past year and a half to 2 years. The infrastructure, obviously we need to update our infrastructure. And again, back to what we were just talking about, who pays for that? How do we split that up so it's equitable? Those are all challenges. We cannot, frankly, we can't build our way out of this right now. It's just physically impossible. So we need the city to sort of pull down some of the barriers so that we can do the best we can to do that, to meet that need. And I think, fortunately we have some bright people over there to help, do that together. And hopefully we can get to that point.
That's a really good compliment. Thank you.
Taiwo, in the plan, I know that it talks about enhancing vibrant cultural scenes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I like to think that one of the things that we did well during the pandemic was supporting the creatives in Charlotte to install the Black Lives Matter mural on Tryon Street. I believe that and there will be a story that will come out of this at some point in time. But what I have heard really is that every single one of those artists that participated, they are so neck deep in opportunities right now because that raised their profile in the community and they were really able to get more. And we know that in the pandemic, like a number of businesses, artists were really hit big time. But when we think about city, one of the things that we have here over and over is that we like to set aside things that are cultural in favor of things that are shiny objects and beautiful and all of that. But how can we make sure that we preserve our historic character as a city while also enhancing a vibrant diversity? Last weekend, I was at a new Nigerian restaurant that just opened up in our city. This coming weekend, I'll be going to a Cuban restaurant that just opened up. Maybe I'm a foodie, and I like to just test different things. But I think part of the plan is really preserving and enhancing those vibrant cultures that we have. That Charlotte continues. The last census data tells us that we're getting more diverse and more, definitely more and more people are moving from different parts of the country and different parts of the world to move into Charlotte. How can we continue to create those different areas to make sure that we enhance a city that attracts this type of thing? One of the conversations I've been having with our new arts and culture lead the city is how can we connect together to make sure that there are certain parts of that comprehensive, and I believe it's goal number 9, that talks a lot about how we enhance creation of vibrant cultures in different neighborhoods. We're seeing that happening. We're seeing a lot more Southeast Asians, East Asian immigrants moving to Ballantyne, for example. We're seeing a lot of people from Latin America moving to Steel Creek rather than East Charlotte. How can we continue to support them and the businesses that they do in those environments as we see these things happen? Charlotte is becoming more diverse over and over again. The comprehensive plan really is looking into the future, that how can we continue to create that type of vibrancy in our culture.
Rob, we talked about how the UDO was just released last week. Can you give us an idea of kind of your plan of attack in terms of being able to absorb and respond to that information?
Well, we have lots of our members, lots of engineers that work for them, going through piece by piece to determine what's existing ordinance versus what's new, and determining what kind of cost effect that may have. I talked about the speediness of review and planning and going through that process and how that's going to offset. And I think the time will tell on that piece of it. But we're just going to sort of absorb it as we can. My sense is by next week, we'll have a pretty good assessment of some of the major things. I kind of jotted down and went over a couple of the initial thoughts that we had. There's one piece that I didn't mention, and it has to do with applicability. And I don't know, Taiwo, if you can speak to this or not, but there's the provision, right? It's on page 2, essentially, of the UDO, of the draft UDO, that talks about applicability. And essentially, the concern I have is it's not very clear as to if you have an approval, then you can go forward under the old regulations. But if you have a submittal, it's not specific as to whether you can go through under the old regulations or the new. And I think state law says that specifically, if you're in the process, you can either pick the old one or the new one. I don't think the UDO draft in its current form really specifies that. And maybe it would be useful to have some language in there that sort of points back to statute and says these are your options going forward. So that's one thing that I think is a pretty major deal. As well as some of the other things that I articulated. But going forward, I think we'll have give and take. And And the great thing about this time around versus the plan is that we have these opportunities. Taiwo talked about economic development, or the economic analysis piece. That meeting's on the 27th. We've got a meeting with some of our engineers next week to go to staff and talk about some of these details. We're going to have continued opportunity to do that, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I think so. That's why it's an initial draft. Wasn't going to be perfect. There's going to be opportunities to really improve upon it. So thank you very much all for bringing those up. And I know that we have meetings with different professionals to highlight some of those areas.
And I think we can all agree that as that communication is happening, everybody benefits. And kind of going back again to the plan, we do have a question from the audience. How does this plan reflect or not reflect other planning efforts like the 2040 Center City Comprehensive Plan and or the county's recreation plans?
Great. So thank you. It does. As a matter of fact, before the plan started, Michael Smith and we met together and we agreed to use the same consultants from Denver, MIG. They have their Berkeley office managing Center City. We had their Denver office managing the comprehensive plan. We also have the same consultant that's doing the economic analysis for us, doing the same thing for Center City. And then right from the bat also, Lee Jones, Director Jones at the county and we started meeting. We actually helped to develop the scope for the county playbook, which is really their recreation master plan. So we've been working together. Are there going to be areas of misses? Probably, yes. But the way I look at it is that the comprehensive plan is that umbrella document. This 2040 Center City plan is the model of what an area plan should be. The University City has a similar one, and they will present it to the Transportation Planning and Environment Committee on the 25th, for example. And that's kind of how we like to see that happen. So they are more detailed than the comprehensive plan will be the focus areas where we do policies and big ideas. And with the county recreational plan, we're also working with them to make sure that as some of these policies are out there, the UDO, the Unified Development Ordinance, which is the regulation, is also tied to implementation of that citywide.
Well, thank you, Taiwo. And Rob, any closing comments that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think I would just say people are moving here for a reason. I think, Kelly, you mentioned 130 people a day. So let's find a way to preserve the reason that they're moving here, but also address the challenges of the future. And I think if we all sort of have an open mind, we can move forward. We're not always going to agree, but do the best we can.
And Taiwo, any closing remarks?
Yes, I agree. People are moving here for a reason. We got to want to make sure that while we encourage that, there are also people who live here today, and we have to make sure that they stay and they love it here and they want to be here, raise their children, raise their grandchildren, and continue to call Charlotte home for the foreseeable future. It's a beautiful city and definitely an attractive city. We have to keep it that way.
And so, Taiwo, in the 30 seconds or less, for those that are tuned in today, how can they get involved?
Great question. CharlotteUDO.org. CharlotteUDO.org. On the first page, you'll see the first draft of the Unified Ordinance, Development Ordinance, an opportunity to provide comments. And then with regards to the policy map, if you go to CLTfuture2040.org, you'll find the policy map as well and be able to provide comments on those. Thank you.
Thank you. And to our audience, thank you for spending some time with us today. We hope that you found this information helpful. We are going to post a satisfactory poll that'll only take about 10 seconds. So before you log off, please do provide your comments and insights so we know as we continue to develop programming what it is that is most helpful to you. So Taiwo and Rob, thank you for your time today. I think that as this continues to evolve, we'd love to have both of you back to continue to answer questions from our audience and share information. We appreciate your support of the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance, and I personally appreciate the opportunity to work with both of you. So again, to the audience, please take the 10 seconds to fill out this poll and submit it. And have a wonderful day. Stay well, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye, everybody. Thank you.